The Curse of the Jade Pond. There's a mountain just outside the quiet village where my grandmother lives, deep in the heart of Southeast Asia. Nestled within that mountain is a beautiful jade-green pond that sparkles like a gemstone, shimmering under the sunlight. The pond is so green it seems unreal, as though it's been pulled from a dream. The villagers call it Talaga Hijau, or the Green Pool. I've always been fascinated by it. Whenever I visited my grandmother, I'd ask about the pond, but the adults always brushed me off with the same warning: stay away from the Talaga Hijau. You don't need to know why. Just don't go near it. That only fueled my curiosity. Why was this beautiful pond forbidden? What could be so dangerous about it? Even the other kids in the village wondered the same. Rumors swirled around Talaga Hijau like the monsoon winds. Anyone who goes there doesn't return, some said. Others whispered about how the pond was bottomless, that it would swallow you whole if you fell in. Still, none of us had the courage to see for ourselves. But when I reached junior high school, the fear began to wane, and logic started to creep in. When I returned to the village during school breaks, the kids I used to play with, Reza, Anya, and her cousin Imran, were as curious as I was. Reza, always the bold one, said, "If no one ever comes back, how does anyone know what it looks like?" And if it was really bottomless, Imran added, someone would have filled it in by now. No one would just leave it there. We all agreed. The legends surrounding Talaga Hijau were likely just stories to scare little kids. The idea of a mysterious, cursed pond was fun when we were younger, but now we wanted to find out the truth. "Let's check it out," Anya suggested one afternoon. She was the adventurous one, always pushing boundaries. We planned to meet early the next morning and hiked to the pond. The mountain was small, and although we'd never been to the pond, we knew the general direction. It would be a short trek, or so we thought. The sun had barely risen when we met at the edge of the village and began our hike. Reza, Anya, Imran, and I climbed through the dense forest, chatting and laughing as we went. The mountain was lush and thick with foliage, and before long, we were panting from the heat and humidity. After nearly 3 hours of hiking, we found a peculiar area where the trees grew unnaturally close together. It was like someone had deliberately planted them in rows, blocking our way forward. Anya, as usual, led the charge. "It has to be through here," she said, squeezing between the tightly packed trees. We had no choice but to follow her. As we pushed through the dense forest, the trees suddenly opened up to reveal Talaga Hijau. It was even more breathtaking than I had imagined. The jade-green water shimmered in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. The pond was eerily quiet, like the world had paused around it, but something was off. There was an old wooden shack standing at the edge of the pond, its wood rotting and overgrown with moss. It spoiled the otherwise idyllic scene. We stood in awe for a moment, the beauty of the pond temporarily overwhelming our unease. Then, Anya broke the silence, pulling out a small bottle from her backpack. "Let's take some of the water back," she said, crouching by the edge of the pond to fill it. Reza and Imran, however, were more interested in the shack. "What do you think's in there?" Reza asked, his voice low. Imran shrugged. "Only one way to find out." They walked towards the shack, but something stopped me. The whole place felt wrong. I didn't want to get closer, and I wasn't alone. Reza hesitated too, stopping just a few feet from the entrance. "I'll wait here," he muttered, his usual bravado gone. "Scared?" Anya teased, joining him. She was already inside the shack before Reza could respond, Imran right behind her. That left me and Reza standing by the pond. I tried to laugh it off, but the truth was I was just as scared as he was. The air around the pond felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us. "Why didn't you go in?" I asked, hoping to distract myself from the growing sense of dread. Reza's face darkened. "I don't like it," he said, staring at the shack. "Something's wrong. I have a bad feeling." "But Anya and Imran are fine," I pointed out. "Why is it okay for them to go in?" He turned towards me, his voice bitter. "I don't care about them. I came here for one reason." His voice dropped to a whisper. "To call Nagaratu." I frowned. "What's Nagaratu? You've never heard of her?" Reza's eyes gleamed with a strange intensity. "The queen of the serpents. She lives here in the pond. If you ask her, she'll grant you anything." A chill ran down my spine. "Grant you what?" Reza grinned, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Revenge. She'll kill anyone you ask her to. I laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke, but Reza's expression didn't change. You think I'm joking? I hate them, both of them, Anya and Imran. They've always looked down on me, always pushed me around, but today Nagaratu will fix that. Something about his voice sent a shiver through me. He wasn't just angry. He was serious. I suddenly realized I didn't know Reza as well as I thought. He was different, darker, colder. I should check on them, I mumbled, edging towards the shack. But before I could take more than a few steps, Reza grabbed my arm. Don't. It's too late for them. I yanked my arm free and hurried towards the shack, fear growing in my chest. The door creaked open with a soft groan as I stepped inside. The air was thick with a foul, rotting smell. As I moved further into the dark room, I heard it, a soft, eerie laugh. Ha! 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 My heart raced as I turned the corner. Anya and Imran were sitting on the floor, their backs against the wall. They were laughing, but it wasn't normal. It was a chilling, high-pitched cackle that echoed off the walls. Ha! Ha! I took a step closer, but they didn't react. They just kept laughing, their eyes wide and unfocused, as if they didn't even see me. Panic surged through me, and I backed away. As I turned to run, something in the corner of the room caught my eye, two glowing white orbs floating in midair. I froze. The orbs blinked slowly, and then they moved toward me. Eyes. They were eyes, glowing white like the blind eyes of something ancient and evil. My body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. Behind me, the laughter grew louder. The white eyes were fixed on me now, unblinking, drawing closer with each passing second. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Suddenly, a voice whispered in my ear, "It's too late for you, too." I spun around and saw Reza standing in the doorway, his eyes just as white as the ones floating in the air. His mouth twisted into a grin, his laughter mixing with that of Anya and Imran. Ha! 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 I stumbled backward, my hands brushing against the sticky, wet walls. My breath came in ragged gasps as I bolted out of the shack, Reza's laughter ringing in my ears. I ran, my legs burning as I fled down the mountain, the sound of their eerie laughter echoing in the trees behind me. When I finally reached the village, drenched in sweat and trembling with fear, the first person I saw was Anya's grandmother. She looked at me with wide eyes, and before I could speak, she grabbed my shoulders. "You went to Telaga Hijau, didn't you?" she cried, shaking me. I nodded, too scared to respond. "It's too late," she whispered, her face pale. "The curse has already begun." The ghostly figure. I don't consider myself a great storyteller, so bear with me. What I'm about to share is a chapter of my life I'd rather forget, but it's etched into my mind forever. I've since moved out of the house where this took place, but the memory still haunts me. This story dates back to my childhood, to a time when things that couldn't be explained started happening. I must have been around 5 years old when I first felt something wasn't right in our house. Like most kids, I slept in my parents' room. The three of us tucked under the same roof on the second floor. Our house was old, over 100 years old, to be precise, passed down through the generations. My parents weren't exactly the superstitious type, but even they couldn't deny the things that happened within those walls. The house creaked and groaned at night, like most old houses do. But these weren't just the typical noises you'd expect from an ancient building settling into the ground. No, I heard footsteps. Footsteps that seemed to move around when no one was supposed to be awake. The sounds were distinct. Sometimes they were the heavy, deliberate steps of an adult, slow and measured, echoing through the quiet of the night. Jishi, jishi. Other times, it was the rapid, light pattering of a child running. Peta, peta, peta. It wasn't just me who heard them either. One night, I whispered to my mom, "Can you hear that? The footsteps downstairs?" She sighed, as though she had heard them too many times to be frightened anymore. "Yeah, I hear them," she said softly. "That's your great-grandfather." Her voice didn't waver, as if this was just a matter of fact. "And sometimes they sound like a child," I continued, unsure if I wanted to hear the answer. "Those are your father's sister's footsteps," she replied matter-of-factly. "She died when she was very young." The house, built by my great-grandfather, had been home to several generations of my family. While my great-grandmother, grandparents, and even my parents were still alive, the footsteps were said to belong to those who weren't. the spirits of my great-grandfather and my father's sister who had died as a baby. Surprisingly, I wasn't scared back then. My mother's nonchalant attitude made it seem as though the presence of these spirits was nothing to worry about. But as I grew older, things started to change. The footsteps became more frequent, and soon I experienced something far worse: sleep paralysis. I didn't know what sleep paralysis was at the time, but it happened often, especially during my junior high years. It started as a feeling of being stuck in my bed, unable to move no matter how much I tried. But soon, the sleep paralysis came with terrifying dreams. I still remember one of those dreams vividly. It was night, and I was walking down a familiar street in my town. Everything was black and white, like the colors had been drained from the world. I was holding hands with a childhood friend, and we were talking about nothing important, just normal, silly stuff. Then my friend stopped. "What's that?" he asked, pointing behind us. I turned around, and there it was. A figure, no taller than an adult, but it wasn't human. It was a shadow. A writhing, shifting shadow that stood upright as if it had its own form, its own life. It didn't belong to anyone. No person was casting it. The shadow was alone, and it was moving toward us. It didn't walk, it teleported. One moment it was far away, the next it had closed the distance between us without moving a muscle. The fear that gripped me in that moment was unlike anything I had ever felt before. I grabbed my friend's hand, and we ran. But no matter how fast we went, the shadow kept getting closer, disappearing and reappearing, muttering something that I couldn't understand. We were trapped. The shadow was about to catch us. Then I woke up. My eyes shot open, and I was back in my bed. But I couldn't move. My body was frozen, locked in place by something unseen. I could only move my eyes, scanning the room. Everything was still, but the terror from the dream lingered. I felt like that shadow was still there, lurking in the corners of my room, waiting. Eventually, the paralysis faded, and I regained control of my body. But I was too scared to sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was it just a dream, or was something truly haunting me? The sleep paralysis happened again the next night, and again the night after that. Each time, it was the same. I would wake up from a dream, trapped in my own body, unable to move, with the suffocating feeling that something was watching me. Each time, I sensed the shadow from my dream, standing just out of sight, waiting for me to slip up and look directly at it. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I woke up, my body rigid with paralysis, and I felt something near the door. I turned my head slowly, and there it was, the shadow. It was standing at the foot of my bed, closer than it had ever been. Its form was indistinct, but I could tell it was looking at me, watching. I shut my eyes tight, praying for it to go away. But it didn't. I could feel its presence beside me, like a weight pressing down on the air. It was suffocating. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and then, finally, it was morning. After that night, the shadow visits became less frequent, but I never forgot the feeling. The sensation of being trapped, the helplessness, the terror of knowing that something was in the room with me. Even now, living in my new home, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, afraid to open my eyes, terrified that I'll see that shadow standing by my bed once again. It's been years, but some things you can never forget. The shadow still haunts me, lingering at the edges of my mind, and though I've moved on, I know deep down it's never truly left. The haunting at Briarcliff Cabin. It was the summer of last year when everything went down. My friend Jake's grandmother had passed away, leaving behind her property in a secluded village called Briarcliff. It was a small, quiet town, far from the bustling city of Halifax, and Jake, being her only grandchild, had inherited the place. Among the various properties she owned, there was a detached cabin by the woods, separate from the main house, which had remained largely unused for years. With the house sitting vacant, Jake invited me, along with two other friends, Michael and Sean, to spend a weekend at the cabin. He figured it would be a good way to clear his head after the funeral and to honor his grandmother's memory with some downtime. The cabin, though small, was more than enough for the four of us. It had a tiny kitchen, bathroom, and 2 bedrooms with tatami-style mats for sleeping. Situated on the edge of a dense forest, the cabin felt isolated, which we figured was perfect for a weekend getaway. The air was crisp, the sounds of nature all around us, and the serene environment seemed like a great escape from the city. The first night, after a few drinks and a barbecue out by the fire pit, we drifted off to sleep, exhausted from the day's activities. The thick, peaceful silence of the forest wrapped around us as we slept soundly. Sometime during the middle of the night, I woke up with an urgent need to pee. Groggily, I rolled over and checked on the others. Jake and Michael were fast asleep, their soft snores filling the room. I grabbed a small flashlight from my bag and quietly crept down the hall toward the bathroom. As I got closer to the bathroom, I noticed something odd. The frosted glass door of the bathroom had a light shining from within. At first, I thought one of the guys had woken up before me, gone in, and forgotten to switch the light off. I knocked softly. "Hey, you in there?" I said, waiting for a response. There was none. I rattled the doorknob but found it locked. Confused, I knocked again, a little louder this time. Still no answer. Now fully awake, I knocked once more, harder this time. "Come on, I just need to pee. Hurry up." The silence persisted. Then suddenly, I saw movement behind the frosted glass. A shadow shifted, just faintly, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was inside. A cold shiver ran down my spine as reality hit me. Everyone was supposed to be asleep in the other room. I turned and bolted back to the room where Jake and Michael were, shaking them both awake. "Guys, wake up! There's something weird going on." Still half asleep, Jake groaned. "What are you talking about? It's the middle of the night." Just as Jake was about to brush me off, we all heard it. A loud bang coming from the hallway. It sounded like someone was rattling the bathroom door from the inside. Jake sat up straight, his face pale now. "What the hell was that?" We all fell silent, listening closely. Sure enough, we heard the distinct sound of the doorknob turning, followed by the eerie creak of the bathroom door. "All right, I'll check it out," Michael said bravely, grabbing his pillow as if it would serve as a weapon. "It's probably just some animal that got inside or something." Jake and I exchanged nervous glances, but followed him into the hallway, each holding our own pillows, as ridiculous as it seemed. The hallway stretched in front of us, dimly lit by the single bulb hanging overhead. At the far end, the bathroom door stood partially ajar, the light inside now flickering. The doorknob was rattling violently. Without warning, Michael let out a shout and rushed toward the bathroom door. "Enough of this crap," he yelled, his voice echoing through the cabin. As soon as he reached the door, the light inside the bathroom shut off, plunging the hallway into darkness. Michael froze. Jake quickly flicked the hallway light back on, and we all stared at the door, waiting for anything to happen. Michael slowly reached for the doorknob. "It's open," he said in disbelief. He pushed the door wide, and we all peered inside. The bathroom was completely empty. There was no way anyone could have left. The only window in the room was barred, and it was open just a crack. We were all silent for a moment, processing what had just happened. Then, trying to make sense of it, Jake spoke up, his voice shaky. "We must be imagining things. Maybe the drinks messed with our heads." We tried to laugh it off, but deep down, we knew something was wrong. Michael, still holding on to his bravado, announced that he was going to use the bathroom first. Jake and I stood in the hallway waiting for him, the air growing thick with unease. That's when the lights went out. All of them. Complete darkness engulfed the cabin. Michael screamed from the bathroom, followed by Jake, yelling in terror. My heart pounded as a cold, eerie voice cut through the silence. "Die for me." The voice echoed through the cabin, neither distinctly male nor female, but low and broken, like it came from another realm. Panic surged through me. We fumbled for the light switches, desperately trying to turn them back on, but nothing worked. In the pitch-black darkness, the voice repeated, growing fainter but more sinister. "Die for me." We bolted. There was no way we were staying in that cabin another second. We ran out into the cold night, the distant roar of the ocean and the wind whipping through the trees our only company. Too scared to go back inside, we waited by the shore, shivering and confused until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. When morning finally came, we hesitantly returned to the cabin, half expecting the worst. But inside, everything was as it had been. No signs of intruders, no strange noises, no broken lights. It was like the night had never happened. We left Briarcliff that morning and never returned. Whatever had haunted that cabin remains a mystery, but one thing is certain: we will never forget the terror we felt that night. The cursed heirloom. In our family, there are 3 cherished heirlooms. Though they may hold little value to others, they are sacred to us. The first is an ancient family tree, tracing our lineage over 4 centuries. The second is a katana, passed down from a long-dead ancestor, a gift from his feudal lord. And finally, there is an old, mysterious mirror. This story is about that mirror, an object that, if the legends are true, holds the power to curse anyone who dares remove it from our family estate. The family tree is kept on scrolls stored in finely crafted cedarwood boxes. Only the family patriarch is allowed to open it. The katana, though valuable, can never be sold and must be maintained by the head of the family monthly. The mirror, however, is the most peculiar. It's an antique polished metal, not glass, as one would expect. Roughly the size of a small plate, the mirror fits in your hand and is kept in the family shrine. The rules regarding the mirror are strict. It must never be removed from its box, and certainly not from the family estate. No matter the occasion, even the patriarch cannot remove it. This rule is law in our family. The mirror is heavy and hexagonal, with a rusted surface that barely reflects light anymore. Despite its flaws, it feels magical, imbued with something more than just history. I first encountered the mirror when I was a child. In elementary school, my friends and I had a treasure contest where we all brought something rare from home to show off at the park after school. While others brought toys, I proudly took the family mirror, thinking it would win me the competition. I warned my friends not to touch it, but of course, they didn't listen. My mirror won the contest, and I strutted home victorious. But that triumph was short-lived. When I returned home, I was greeted by my father's wrath. He wasn't furious about the mirror being damaged. It wasn't, but he was livid that I had taken it out at all. He lectured me for hours about the importance of the mirror, how it should never leave the house, and why it was dangerous. As a child, I didn't understand the gravity of it all. To me, it was just an old, rusty thing with no real reflection. Life moved on, and the mirror faded from my memory. That is, until I turned 20. I was attending university and living away from home when my father summoned me back to the family estate. I wasn't sure why, but I had a feeling it was important. When I arrived, my father brought me into the room with the family shrine and began explaining the significance of our heirlooms. He reiterated the rules about the family tree and katana, but lingered on the mirror. Our lineage goes back to the time of ancient rituals and curses, he said. He explained that many of the family heirlooms were once cursed objects, acquired through our ancestors' dealings with the supernatural. Most had been donated to museums or lost to time, but a few remained, chief among them, the mirror. My father told me the mirror wasn't just an heirloom, it was cursed. According to legend, the mirror had been taken out of the estate 3 times, and each time the person who removed it had met a disastrous fate. He said it was a death mirror, a mirror that showed the reflection of a person's death. This wasn't some family superstition. The curse had been taken seriously for the past 3 decades after a tragic event involving my grandmother. 30 years ago, my grandmother, who was once the matriarch of the family, died under mysterious circumstances. I had always been told it was an accident, but the details were sparse. My father's retelling painted a clearer, much darker picture. In the early 1980s, my grandmother didn't believe in the curse of the mirror. She would often show it to guests, laughing at the idea that something so old and battered could hold any real power. One summer during Oban, a festival honoring the spirits of ancestors, she decided to take the mirror with her to Osaka. It was a clear break in family tradition, but she insisted. As she packed her belongings for the trip, she took one last look at the mirror. For the first time, she saw something in its rusted surface, a dark, shadowy reflection of herself. Panicked, she rushed to compare her reflection in the bathroom mirror, but what she saw in the family mirror was entirely different. Her face in the heirloom was pitch black. My father told her it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps her imagination. Still, she insisted on taking the mirror to the family temple in Kyoto to have it purified. Against his better judgment, my father relented, allowing her to take it with her. He would later regret that decision deeply. On December 18, 1985, my grandmother boarded a flight from Haneda Airport to Osaka. The cursed mirror was with her. At precisely 6:04 p.m., the plane crashed. There were no survivors. My father believes the mirror caused the crash, that my grandmother's decision to take it off the estate triggered the curse. The mirror was recovered from the wreckage, completely unharmed. Since then, the family has kept it securely locked in the shrine, never to leave again. As my father finished the story, he placed the mirror on the table before me. "This is why we never remove it from its box," he said. "The curse is real, and it's dangerous." I could see the weight of his words in his eyes, the fear and respect he had for the ancient artifact. I didn't touch the mirror that day, nor have I touched it since. The mirror remains in our family shrine, a relic of the past that holds the power to destroy those who do not respect its curse. The house by the river. My grandparents on my mother's side lived in an old, sprawling house nestled by the banks of a slow-moving river in the town of Cedar Valley. The house, a relic of bygone days, had seen countless family gatherings, stories, and secrets over the years. With creaky floorboards and long, shadow-filled corridors, it was the perfect setting for childhood adventures and for things better left undiscovered. The house was so old that several sections had fallen into disrepair, including a detached guest house that hadn't been used in decades. My grandmother often warned me and my younger cousins to steer clear of the old structure, claiming it was too dangerous. "You kids stay away from there. The floorboards are rotten, and there's no telling what's in there," she'd say with a worried glance in its direction. This particular event took place when I was in 4th grade, during the summer holidays. Every summer, the entire extended family gathered at my grandparents' home to celebrate various festivals. This year, we were there for the Cedar Festival, a local tradition. Being the oldest of all the kids, I was tasked with keeping my cousins entertained while the adults gathered for their late-night conversations. After the ceremonial events ended, the sliding doors in the main hall were opened, and we all ate together, kids and adults alike. It was an annual tradition. As the adults settled into their evening party, the kids, myself included, found ourselves free to explore the house. This freedom often led to mischief. That evening, as the adults got louder with their drinks, one of my cousins, Leo, found an old flashlight in the hallway closet. The discovery sparked excitement. We began using it to cast shadows on the walls, and soon enough, we started talking about embarking on an adventure. Naturally, the forbidden guest house became our target. Despite all the warnings, I couldn't resist the idea of showing off my bravery. My cousins, Leo, Oliver, and my younger sister, Clara, were all eager to join but hesitant. As the eldest, I took charge. I whispered my plan to my father, who, tipsy from the evening's festivities, slurred, "Sure, just be careful." We crept down the hallway, the flashlight casting a thin beam of light ahead. Passing through the dimly lit kitchen and the old storeroom, we reached the back entrance where the glass door leading to the guest house stood. It was pitch black outside, and the beam of light barely penetrated the thick darkness beyond the door. When I opened the door, a rush of musty air greeted us. An old smell of wood, dust, and something else, something damp. The hallway beyond was long and narrow, with creaky wooden floors and faded tatami mats. At the far end of the hall was a single wooden door. "I bet there's something cool behind that door," I said confidently, though in reality, my heart was racing. "Do we really have to go inside?" Clara asked, gripping my arm. "Yeah, I'll go first," I said, trying to hide my own fear. I turned to Leo, who was holding the flashlight. "Keep the light steady." Steeling myself, I took the lead. The wooden boards creaked ominously under my feet as I moved down the hallway. The smell of rot seemed to grow stronger with each step. I could hear my cousins whispering behind me, their voices a mix of excitement and fear. My hand hovered over the knob of the wooden door. "Here we go," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. With a loud creak, the door opened. I stumbled forward slightly, and at that exact moment, a loud screech echoed through the dark. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. The flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. Then, from somewhere in the house, a cat meowed. I screamed silently, the sound trapped in my throat, and backed away from the door as fast as I could, nearly tripping over my own feet. Before I could even regain my balance, I saw my cousins bolting back down the hallway, leaving me behind in the dark. "Wait for me," I shouted, sprinting after them. As I ran, the door behind me slammed shut with an eerie finality. I didn't dare look back. We burst into the room where the adults were gathered, breathless and terrified. Leo and Clara were already there, huddled together and crying. My father gave me a stern look, despite his earlier indifference. "What happened? Why are you all scared?" one of the aunts asked, but no one could answer coherently. "There was a monster!" Leo yelled, still clutching the flashlight. The adults exchanged glances, and soon the evening's party was called to an end. As relatives left for the night, I managed to calm down a little, though the memory of that creaky door and the meow still lingered. Later, when I was alone with Clara, I asked her what she had seen. She hesitated before saying, "When you opened the door, I saw someone. There was a person standing in the room beyond, but you crawling back was scarier." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "A person?" I echoed. In the days that followed, I asked Leo and Oliver what they had seen. Their stories were wild and inconsistent. Leo swore a dog with glowing red eyes had chased us, while Oliver claimed he saw a ghostly woman stretching her neck toward us. None of their stories matched, but Clara's quiet insistence about the person behind the door stayed with me. Later that summer, my grandmother pulled me aside and whispered, "That old guest house has been empty for decades, but there was once a cat. A stray lived there for years, and it always meowed, until one day it just disappeared. Maybe it's still there, watching over the place." I never went back to the guest house, and I don't think I ever will, but sometimes, when I pass by it, I still hear that meow echoing in the night. Perhaps it wasn't just the cat. Perhaps, in the dark corners of that old house by the river, something, or someone, still lingers, waiting. The Lantern of Ebenvale. I heard this story when I visited my childhood home in the rural village of Ebenvale recently. It's a story that sent shivers down my spine, and I feel compelled to write it down. There's a long-standing custom in Ebenvale that, after visiting someone's grave, we walk back to the main house while carrying a lantern. It might sound like a simple ritual, but it comes with some very strict rules. Here are the conditions. The lantern flame must never go out. If it does, you must immediately return to the grave and relight it. You must not run. The youngest person present must carry the lantern. If the youngest is a baby or incapable, the next oldest person will carry it. Under no circumstances must you look at the Willow Shrine. The fourth rule always stuck out to me. The Willow Shrine is an old stone structure hidden in a small grove, set apart from the rice fields that dominate the landscape. It stands eerily alone along the path from the graveyard to the main house. The rule forbids anyone from glancing at it as they walk by. When I was young, I had the duty of carrying the lantern. My parents were firm in their instructions. This lantern helps guide our ancestors from their grave to the family altar. If the flame goes out, they'll get lost, they said. As a child, I thought it was strange, but followed their guidance without question. I vividly remember my mother covering my eyes when we approached the willow shrine. I giggled, thinking she was playing a game. When we passed, she uncovered my eyes and we safely reached home. The flame was transferred to a candle on the family altar, concluding the ritual. For years, I never thought much about the custom, but when I returned home recently, curiosity got the better of me. I asked my grandmother about the significance behind these rules, especially why it was so important not to look at the shrine. "Oh, we never told you the full story, did we?" she replied, her voice dropping as if she were about to reveal something forbidden. What she told me left me stunned. The flame must never go out because it's not just a light, it's a guide for the ancestors' spirit. Without it, they won't find their way home. You must not run because running attracts it. The youngest carries the lantern because they are closest to their ancestors' protection. The lantern shields them from it. And as for the willow shrine, you must never look at it because if you do, your ancestor will lose the power to protect you. Hearing her mention it multiple times made me nervous. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Grandmother's expression darkened. "We don't speak of it much. What it lives in the willow shrine." She explained that it was a creature that had lived in the shrine for as long as anyone could remember. It was said to resemble a grotesque figure with long limbs, somewhat like a monkey but far more sinister. Most of the year, it was dormant, but during the summer, around the Oban festival, it became dangerous. "It has a name," grandmother continued, "but we do not speak it. If you know its name, you'll be drawn to the shrine, and if you see it, there's nothing your ancestor can do to save you." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. As a child, I had never understood the danger my mother was shielding me from by covering my eyes. I silently thanked her for protecting me. But then, grandmother told me of a time when the ritual went wrong, when someone had broken one of the rules. "There was a year when the lantern's flame went out on the way back to the house," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The person carrying it looked at the shrine. That year, someone in the family died by the next Oban. It always happens that way." I wanted to dismiss her story as superstition, but then she added, "You know Finn, don't you? He died last year. He was taken by it." Finn was my cousin. He died in a tragic accident last year. According to what I was told, he was driving along a straight road when, for no apparent reason, he swerved into the river and drowned. It had puzzled everyone. He was a careful driver, and the road was dry. Now, hearing grandmother's explanation, I felt a deep unease. "Last summer, the ritual failed," grandmother said, confirming my worst fears. "Little Ollie was the one carrying the lantern. He saw it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Ollie, a relative's child, had been the lantern bearer. He had seen the creature in the shrine, and afterward, nothing could stop the disaster that followed. Despite attempts to purify him, Finn had died before the next Oban, just as the legend predicted. I left the house feeling unsettled. This tradition, which I had once seen as an innocent custom, now felt like something far more ominous. I couldn't help but worry. Had this year's ritual gone smoothly? The ceremony had already taken place before I arrived, but the shadow of dread lingered over me. Next year, I vowed to return to Ebonvale and participate in the ritual again. This time, I wouldn't treat it lightly. I'd ensure the lantern stayed lit and that no one, especially the youngest among us, looked at the willow shrine. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching, waiting for another chance to strike. As I left the village, I glanced back toward the rice fields, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a figure moving near the shrine, something long-limbed and shadowy. I quickly turned away, heart pounding, not daring to look back again. The nightmare at Clearbrook Hill. It's been over 2 decades since that summer, but the memory still lingers in my mind. I was just a kid in elementary school, probably no older than 7 or 8. My family and I used to visit the countryside for the annual Harvest Festival, and that year we went to Clearbrook Hill, a small town where my grandparents lived. The fresh air, wide open fields, and towering hills were so different from the city. It felt like a dream. That year, my cousin Ethan, who was the same age as me, also came along with his family. We hadn't seen each other in a long time, and it was exciting to run around together again with our bug-catching nets in hand. The countryside was a treasure trove of adventures, and before long, we found ourselves standing at the base of Clearbrook Hill, the mountain behind my grandparents' house. "There's gotta be some huge bugs up there," I said, my eyes gleaming with excitement. Ethan grinned. "What if they're too big to fit in the net?" We both laughed at the idea of mutant bugs, not really believing it, but our imaginations ran wild. The hills seemed to be teeming with life, buzzing and humming with insects we'd never seen before. We climbed up the trails, eagerly searching for our next big find. But just as we were getting into the fun, Ethan suddenly froze. I need to go to the bathroom," he said awkwardly. I chuckled. "You want to head back to the house?" Ethan shook his head, looking a little panicked. "No time, man. I gotta go now." He darted into some nearby bushes, crouching down with his pants around his ankles. I turned away, giving him some privacy, fiddling with the pockets of my shorts as I tried to find the tissues my mom had packed. I heard the unmistakable sound of relief behind me as Ethan did his business, but then without warning, a blood-curdling scream erupted from the bushes. I whipped around. "Ethan, what happened?" Ethan stumbled out of the bushes, his pants still only half up, and his face twisted in pure horror. His legs, from the knees down, were covered in writhing, dark red creatures. Leeches. Dozens of them. I'd never seen leeches before, having grown up in the city, but I knew what they were from stories my parents had told me. Still, nothing could have prepared me for seeing so many of them attached to my cousin's bare legs, sucking the life out of him. "Get them off me!" he screamed, swatting at his legs as he tried in vain to flick the leeches away. I panicked, pulling a tissue out of my pocket and thrusting it toward him, but Ethan was beyond reason. He wiped himself once, twice, then threw off his pants entirely. The leeches weren't just on his legs, they covered his feet, his ankles, and were even creeping up his thighs. He looked like some kind of monster from a nightmare, his lower half painted with red blotches where the leeches had latched on, sucking blood. "Help me!" he screamed again, his eyes wide with terror. I could barely think. Fear surged through me, and without another word, I turned and ran. I bolted down the mountain trail, heading straight for my grandparents' house, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear Ethan behind me, still calling for help, but the sight of those leeches crawling all over him had completely broken my nerve. I thought if he caught me, I'd end up just like him, covered in blood-sucking monsters. "Mom! Dad!" I cried as I tore through the door to my grandparents' house, nearly tripping over the doorstep in my rush. As I kicked off my sandals, I looked down and screamed. My feet were covered in leeches too. Dozens of them clung to my toes and ankles, just like on Ethan. I was turning into a leech man, just like him. I ran through the hallway shouting for the adults, leaving a trail of tiny, bloody footprints behind me. My sandals were long forgotten as I burst into the living room, where my aunt, uncle, and parents were sitting. My mom screamed when she saw me, but before I could even reach them, I heard more yelling from behind. Ethan had arrived. He was completely naked from the waist down, his legs drenched in blood and dotted with still more leeches. My aunt shrieked, covering her mouth in horror as my uncle rushed toward him. "Lighter! Get a lighter!" My uncle yelled, grabbing a match from the kitchen. My grandparents, who had heard all the commotion, hurried into the room, and within seconds, everyone was running around, trying to figure out how to help us. My uncle flicked the lighter near Ethan's legs, burning the leeches off one by one. The creatures shriveled and dropped to the floor as if they were melting. The adults stomped on them, crushing them into the hardwood floor. But even as they fell off, the blood didn't stop. Ethan's body was covered in smears of red, and the bleeding just wouldn't slow down. It was the same with my feet, even after my mom had carefully plucked off the leeches with a pair of tweezers. The blood kept flowing. We ended up at the hospital that night. The doctors told us that leeches secrete a chemical that prevents blood from clotting, which explained why we couldn't stop bleeding. I was patched up quickly, but Ethan had lost so much blood that they kept him overnight for observation. He lay in his hospital bed, wrapped in bandages like a mummy. "I'm sorry," I mumbled, feeling guilty for running away. Ethan gave me a weak smile. "Thanks for the tissue." As we left the hospital, I noticed two police officers talking with my grandfather. I didn't know who called them, but I overheard them talking about clearing the hill behind the house. The next day, the entire neighborhood came out with tools and sprayed chemicals all over Clearbrook Hill. The air was thick with the pungent smell of pesticides, but no one wanted to take chances with the leeches. Ethan stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks. They were worried about infections, but thankfully, he recovered. When we returned the following summer, neither of us felt like exploring the mountain again. Years later, after my grandfather passed, Ethan inherited the house at Clearbrook Hill. He still lives there, and oddly enough, he's become an expert on leeches. But whenever I visit, I can't help but feel like the number of leeches has somehow increased since Ethan moved in. And sometimes I wonder if he's really studying them, or something else entirely. The Forest of Echoes. About 10 years ago, I lived in a remote village deep in the mountains, a place where the nearest town was miles away. Our little home was nestled between thick forests and towering peaks. My family wasn't wealthy, and we weren't farmers by trade, but we kept a small plot of land, just enough to grow rice for ourselves. That tiny patch of field was our lifeline, but the real wilderness lay beyond. An endless expanse of dark woods that stretched to the very tops of the mountains. The village itself had no playgrounds or stores. Instead, the old temple grounds and the shadowy forest served as our playground. When my two younger brothers and I weren't at school, we'd spend our days playing among the trees, chasing each other in games of tag or hide and seek. As kids, we didn't think much about the legends that the older folks would tell. Tales of the spirits that roamed the woods, of creatures that could lead you astray and make you disappear forever. But one day, that all changed. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and my brothers and I had just returned from school. We decided to take the familiar animal trail through the woods to the temple, as we had countless times before. The path was barely visible, just a narrow strip of earth winding through the dense trees. But we knew it well, using the sacred trees as our guideposts to navigate. These trees, marked with old, worn talismans, were said to ward off evil spirits. That day, the woods seemed quieter than usual. Still, we brushed it off as nothing more than the usual silence of the forest. We started a game of hide and seek. It was my turn to count. I turned to face one of the sacred trees, covered my eyes, and slowly began to count to 10. But as I counted, the usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the buzzing of insects, suddenly vanished. It was as if the entire world had fallen silent. I paused, feeling a cold chill run down my spine. Something felt wrong. My voice trembled as I called out my brothers' names, but there was no reply. I began searching, my heart pounding in my chest. I checked all the usual hiding spots behind the trees, under the rocks, but my brothers were nowhere to be found. A rising panic gripped me. They had never hidden this well before. I shouted again, "I can't find you, give me a hint." Silence. No clapping, no laughter, nothing but the eerie, oppressive quiet. Evening was approaching and the shadows in the forest seemed to lengthen unnaturally. I felt the urge to flee, to run back home and pretend none of this was happening. But my brothers, they'd never leave me alone like this. That thought alone kept me rooted in place. I tried retracing my steps, but as I walked, I realized something was horribly wrong. No matter how far I went, I kept seeing the same trees. Over and over, the same sacred trees loomed ahead of me, their talismans swaying gently in a wind I couldn't feel. Desperation clawed at me, and I began marking trees with a small stone. Yet when I circled back, the marks had vanished, like they'd never been there at all. I wandered for what felt like hours, but the sky never seemed to grow darker. It was as if time had frozen. I was trapped in a never-ending twilight, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Exhausted and terrified, I found myself drawn back to one of the sacred trees. I sat down at its base, clutching my knees to my chest, trying to calm the storm of fear rising inside me. Suddenly, there was a noise, a faint thud from the other side of the tree. My breath caught in my throat. It was the first sound I had heard that wasn't my own. Heart racing, I slowly rose and crept around the massive trunk of the tree. There, standing in the clearing, was a creature. At first, I thought it was a dog, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was something else. Its fur was a pale, yellowish color, almost glowing in the fading light. It was a fox, but far larger than any I had ever seen before. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief moment, I felt paralyzed, unable to move. The creature didn't seem hostile, but there was something unsettling about it. It began to circle the sacred tree, its movements slow and deliberate. I watched, frozen, as it completed 3 slow laps around the tree. Then, without warning, it began to walk away, down the very path I had taken earlier. After a few steps, it stopped and turned to look back at me, its tail swishing slowly as if beckoning me to follow. I hesitated. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to follow, to turn and run in the opposite direction. But something about the fox felt safe, familiar even, as if it knew the way out of this nightmare. I began to follow it, keeping my distance, but it never let me out of its sight. Every few steps, it would pause and glance back, ensuring I was still there. The further we walked, the darker the forest grew. The sacred trees disappeared, replaced by gnarled, twisted oaks that seemed to loom over me like silent sentinels. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we emerged from the woods. I blinked in the sudden light, realizing we had arrived at the temple grounds. My brothers and my mother were there, searching frantically. The moment they saw me, they ran over, hugging me tightly. I cried, overwhelmed with relief. When I turned to thank the fox, it was gone, disappeared without a trace. The next morning, the village elder told us that 5 foxes had been found dead in the forest near the sacred trees, their bodies mangled as if by some unseen force. They whispered about dark spirits and cursed places, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the fox, the one that had led me out, had saved me from something far worse. Even now, years later, I still remember those silent woods, the endless twilight, and the eerie presence of the fox. The forest hasn't changed, and every time I visit, I can't help but feel like it's watching, waiting. Just like it was that day.